All right, everyone, welcome once more to another webcast of Alexandra Mayers Live. Remember, you can always follow me on Twitter at Alex Mayers Live. Today, once more, I have Mr. Stephen Washington of the Black Wealth Network, and he has something that he wants to get off his chest in regards to a current issue that's made mainstream media headlines in regards to the Black Wealth Gap. So, I'm just going to go ahead and let you jump right into it, Steve, because I did read that article a bit, but what is your perspective and what did you want to share?
Thank you. And I'll send you the other connected links that go with this. You probably got the main one that had the video attached to the bottom of it probably. But early last week, and we talked about this subject a couple times in earlier videos about, the Black Wealth Gap. So earlier this week, or actually last week, a group of mostly academics, researchers, professors, pretty well known for doing economic research, who I follow on Twitter and have interacted with, even, promoted their research in my classes and so forth, and shown videos. They came out with a research report called the 10, let me be exact. They came out with a brand new research report specifically named, I want to get it right, What We Got Wrong About Closing the Racial Wealth Gap, right? And they identified 10 myths regarding closing, which sounds good. The overarching premise is, there's these myths out there that if, Black people just do this, that'll close the wealth gap. And that it's really not systemic racism, it's African-American personal ineffectiveness, meaning, you guys aren't doing enough for these things, that's why the racial wealth gap isn't closing. And so what they set out to do is prove that none of those things will close the racial wealth gap. Therefore, the only way to do so is through a massive government redistribution of wealth, right? Either reparations or baby bonds, which I can explain what those are real quick, or a combination of the two. And then there's some other things like they're pushing a federal jobs guarantee, meaning no one would ever be unemployed, because if you became unemployed, instead of getting unemployment, you would actually just work for the government. Basically, almost like a form of socialism. But so these are, depending on how you want to look at it, maybe not. So when I first saw this, because I was familiar with some of the research that these people did, I was like, oh, this is pretty sweet. It reminds me of going to see Black Panther. At first I was like, oh, this is kind of cool. Look at the pretty colors and the beautiful Black people and Wakanda. That'd be nice. And then as the movie goes through, and then more importantly, after you go home and think about it, you're like, wait a minute, that was kind of messed up. Actually, that was very bad. This is sort of similar. I mean, it sounds good that there's these popular myths, but then when you read it, you discover that it's really not that helpful to Black people to look at things that way. But not only that, it's sort of self-serving. They've got an ulterior motive. So I just wanted to sort of go through some of that, really for the benefit of people who come across this type of information and then can take it the wrong way and not understand how academic research works. So
I think that this is a really good thing for you to be covering today, because, right now we have two Black faces in the mainstream media that are trying to tell us that Trump is okay. And it's a male and a female, and they've actually connected on social media. I'm talking about Kanye West and Candace Owens. I've mentioned in the past, and I'm going to let the situation progress before I share my thoughts. I probably won't share my thoughts about her until maybe towards the end of the year, mainly because I'm seeing something happening with that young woman that I really don't like seeing. At the same time, there's things in regards to her history, who she is in her life, that I personally can identify with. I can see how if I had had certain influences in my life at certain key juncture points, I would likely sound not too dissimilar from Candace Owens, which is why I'm restraining myself for the next few months just to see how she progresses, because I don't want to jump the gun in regards to my final opinion on her at this stage in her life. But when I look at a young woman such as her, who is suddenly attaining something that she's desired in life for a long time, but it's being given to her from some individuals who I don't think have good intention. When I look at her, when I look at Kanye West and what he's doing, at least as of now, I understand why that list that you're about to go over came out. I think that as Black people in America, be you of African descent, or maybe you're Black but from somewhere else, you got to make up your own mind about what's what and live your own life, and not really listen to what other people say is, because the only reality that's really real for anybody is their own individual reality. Yeah. So, all right, well, go ahead. Let's go through point by point. You said 10 points. Let's start with number one.
And we'll go through them quickly, but I'll say up front, only 6 of them are even worth talking about.
Well, let's just talk with the 6.
But so the thing is here, first of all, I've been in academia for over 20 years teaching finance and economics, and 30 years in just finance and investments in industry combined. And one thing about academic research, there's 2 types of academic research for people who aren't in academia. There's groundbreaking research, like a discovery, a new process, a breakthrough drug, a new whatever, something that changes the industry, people's lives, and makes money, whatever. Then there's research with a motive, research with almost like a predetermined outcome. So let's manipulate or gather the data to prove it because we got something else in mind behind it. Most research is the latter, because most academics do have a motive. It could be, I need to complete my PhD, so I got to write this research. I want to get tenure that require you to write research. I'm writing a book. So usually that's the research, all right? And this is, I think, a pretty good example of that. So what they say is there are these myths that really don't close the wealth gap. So if you're a Black person and you're doing these things, that's fine, but it's not helping to close the wealth gap. So the first thing I looked at was they never defined what is wealth gap closure. Okay, we all understand what the wealth gap is, the difference between the average white person's wealth and the average Black person's wealth across spectrums, whether you're doing it for education, gender, whatever. No matter how you look at it, there's a huge wealth gap between Black and white people all the way up the scale. In fact, the higher you get up the education and wealth scale, the wider the gap gets. You know what I mean?
Well, was this only focused on Black versus white, or did they factor in other ethnic groups also?
Good question. I mean, and the hard data is Black versus white. They do talk about other people, but we're really talking about white versus Black. Okay.
And how are they defining white, and how are they defining Black? Do they even say?
Very generically, just white and Caucasian versus African American, generically, right?
Are all the Black people, do they all have Black parents, or are they factoring in biracial people as Black too?
So they're using mostly government data, and research has already been done, mostly probably based on government data, which is going to be based on things like the Survey of Consumer Finances and the census and stuff like this. So those stratifications.
So they're running very wild and loose with the definition of white and Black.
I wouldn't say that. I would just say that they don't spend a lot of time trying to define that specificity of white versus Black ethnically in this paper. They probably could if they. I'm not.
Well,
saying,
then the whole paper. I mean, really, the whole paper in that case is null and void, in my opinion. But let's continue.
Well, I mean, so,
go ahead. I'm just throwing all this in there because this is how I think.
Right.
But
right.
Go ahead.
Yeah, you would. But here's the base. So if you think about it, that makes sense that these various actions may not close the macro wealth gap, or if you do all these things together, it may not do it. But what they don't say, and the distinction is not clear, that most of these things, at least the first six, can help you build wealth. So there's a distinction between building wealth in your individual household, and then we as a people, in a macroeconomic sense, closing a gap. Okay. So so their premise is a little bit disingenuous in that wealth gap closure is not even defined, meaning when you say closing the wealth gap, do you mean 100% wealth equity with white people? Because if that's what you mean, you're talking about a multi-century process. It took us 500 years to get in this hole. If you're talking about 100% equity, meaning we have equal wealth with white people, you're talking about hundreds of years from now, literally, at best. If you're talking about, okay, wealth gap closure means we close the gap by at least 10% every 20 years. I don't know, however you want to define it, then it has context. You know what I mean? So you can say, well, this isn't going to do it because it doesn't meet that standard, or this does do it because it does. What they keep saying is this can't close the wealth gap. And it's like, well, what do you mean by close the wealth gap? And here's what I mean, just to illuminate this, and then we'll move on. With any gap, there's only three ways to close any gap, right? If you have point A and point B, if point A is white people, either their wealth stays the same while we increase our wealth incrementally, which makes no sense in an economy, or somehow their wealth decreases while ours either stays the same or increases at the same time, which doesn't make any sense in an economy, or somehow our wealth attainment and growth supersedes white wealth attainment and growth, which is tough for any sustained period of time in an economy. My point being, wealth gap closure is A, undefined, and B, you really can't control it because you can't control white wealth growth, and you don't know what it's going to be in the future. So in other words, we could grow our wealth and still not close the wealth gap. See what I'm saying? So until you define for me, what do you mean by wealth gap closure? Don't tell me that this can't do it or that can do it. You don't even know. We don't even really know what that means. So that's my.
Well, do you think? In regards to that, in regards to what it might mean, do you think it might mean mass genocide? I'm just putting that out there
that's not what
that's a way that it could feasibly be closed, and maybe that's what this article is really about. Maybe they're saying, well, look, here's what's going to happen. We're just going to go ahead and kill off the majority of everybody, but the remaining blacks will be making the same amount of the remaining whites. There we go.
Yeah,
all right, go ahead and continue.
That's the most draconian.
All right.
Closure. But I think they mean some relative wealth.
What's wrong with being draconian? That's who our government is. But okay, all right. But I know I do agree because they haven't defined it. But maybe they just couldn't put it in the paper because it's so horrible.
Well, I think what it is that they're not trying to actually. They're not trying to measure that. They're just trying to create.
Because it's all about the numbers. You know, you can manipulate.
They got something behind it. They want to promote. They have something political they want to promote behind it. The whole lack of a real, true definition of what closure is, or at what point do you achieve acceptable closure? What is that? That's not in there, so it's hard to really. So anyway, so then as you go through the 10 myths, as they call it. The first one is greater educational attainment or more work effort on the part of blacks will not close the racial wealth gap. That's true. So again, you're talking about closing a gap. So it's probably true because it's already been proven that wealth gaps exist all the way up the education scale, Therefore, the more education you get, that does not close the gap between you and white people.
I mean, it seems to me like what they're really saying here is that they want more blacks to get the official ticket into quote unquote white America, which is the college degree. So that's what they're really saying here. They're not really talking about, you know, increasing your worldview or broadening your perspective. They're just talking about going to an approved college that would close.
Yeah, they're talking.
Yeah, I see what they're saying.
They're talking about formal education, because that's where the research sort of.
And then they're talking about we need to start banking. You know, I have two different perspectives on that, because on one hand, I feel like, okay, it's good to put back into your own community, but then I feel like that's, you know, kind of encourage segregation. But what do you think about that?
Well, what they're trying to say is by banking black or buying black, that doesn't really close the wealth gap. And they go through all that, which might be true.
Right.
The reason to buy black or bank black, in my opinion, isn't because it closes the wealth gap, because we can't really control wealth gap closure. You do it to support people in your community who are trying to build wealth through entrepreneurship in their own families. So to me, buying black, banking black, supporting black businesses is a intra-community way, for the most part locally, for most people, to support other black people who are trying to build family wealth within their businesses. Now, will that actually close the black-white wealth gap? Probably not, because it's not enough asset wealth and growth in of itself to do it. But it's still a good thing to do. So see, my point is they're saying things that are myths with respect to closing the gap, which are actually healthy things for us to do, in spite of the fact that it might not close the gap. And I think the way the tone of the report almost makes it seem like doing these things ain't gonna do you no good. Going to college, that ain't gonna do you no good. Starting a business, that ain't gonna do you no good. Saving an investment, that ain't gonna do you no good. That's sort of the tone. When in reality, you know, building wealth is different from closing the macroeconomic wealth gap. And the message I want people to know is that a lot of what they're saying are myths in terms of wealth gap closing are things that we all need to do. Like for example, we were just on educational attainment, and they're saying, well, that won't help close the wealth gap. But it did for all of them individually. These are people with PhDs at universities getting paid well. So don't tell me that, you know, educational attainment can't help build wealth. Now, do they make as much as their white counterparts with the same PhD? Statistically, probably not. I mean, they've proven that, but that doesn't mean you shouldn't do it. I mean, that's how they're building their wealth, through their education, and then applying that education to research, and then getting promoted, getting tenure. So I think they're conflating concepts by not giving credence to the common sense of doing what you need to do to build your own family's wealth. Another one that they point out is saving. They say saving does not close the wealth gap. And again, their logic is that if you adjust, this is the logic, if you adjust for income, how academics are, they always have to make an adjustment. So the numbers come out right to make their point. If you adjust for income, African Americans are actually more frugal than most people and actually save at the same rate, even though we don't have as much in savings. And again, it might be true that savings in of itself is not closing the wealth gap. And they say nothing about investing, by the way. But if you save and invest, I'm the best example of it, because I make less than any of them. But I started saving in earnest about 20 years ago, which I was in my mid-30s, which is way too late to start. But I've still managed to, because of aggressive saving and investment, and I hate to put, but I've been able to, compile dollars in a 20-year. So you can elevate your own personal net worth. My point is, an individual can save and invest their way into a better personal wealth position, even if they're not, quote unquote, closing some some gap, right? And so um, I think that the takeaway is when you like research like this, you got to be careful because you never know when there's an ulterior motive. So what I did was I went out and did a little more research into the two main publishers and found out that they're out there promoting what they feel are alternatives to all these things that will close the wealth gap. And as it turns out, none of them make sense either. In other words, the stuff they're promoting is no more proven and has, in terms of the structure they're promoting, has no better chance of, quote unquote, closing any gaps than anything.
So in other words, these articles that you're found, both of them, I found the one that you sent me and the one that you're referring to. These articles are really just kind of like clickbait to pique your curiosity about who's bestowing this knowledge upon the Black people, and then you find out about what they're up to. So it's just like a, you know, inadvertent advertisement for themselves. Is that what this is?
In a roundabout way, in that what they're promoting, which is political, right? Meaning they're promoting a change in political policy. Like one of the main things that they're promoting that they think is like some breakthrough innovation is what's called baby bonds, a concept where every child, when they're born, gets a government-funded bond between either $500 if you're at the top of the wealth chain, up to $50,000 if you're at the bottom. With the logic being, since Black people are statistically poorer based on wealth, it'll disproportionately impact positively African Americans, which on paper is true. But here's what they go on to say. They say when the kid turns 18, they get the money, and they say on average it's $20,000, and then it can be used for education, college education, starting a business, or buying a home, which are three things in their report they say are wealth gap building myths. Get it? So they have a solution, which then at the end of the day says, once you get the money, do what we already say does not work in terms of closing the wealth gap. So when I challenged one of the authors on that, like, hey, your solution points right back to what you just said was a myth, this is what he told me. He said there's a difference, and this is how you know an academic is talking. He said there's a distinction between the behavior of investing and the ability to purchase an asset. And I was like, wow, in my 30 years of finance and investments, and I said, what do you mean by behavior of invest? When you invest, you are purchasing an asset. When you purchase an asset, you're investing. Both are the same behaviors. What are you talking about? He said, I did an interview on Canadian Broadcast Network. Go look at that. In other words, and the reason why is that makes no sense, right? The reality is, if you give an 18-year-old $20,000 and tell them to go buy a house or start a business, the likelihood of that eventually closing some wealth gap doesn't make sense. On top of that, they think the money should grow annually at 1% to 2%, which is below the rate of inflation.
Well, you know, okay, with this baby bond concept, well, that would be interesting if that happened. I'm going to tell you why. Because you're saying that there's like a sliding scale for this baby bond thing. So I guess like different people of different ethnic backgrounds get different amounts of money, correct?
Of different wealth backgrounds, not different. So everybody, Black and white, would get the same amount of money depending on how wealthy their family is. So poor white kids could get just as much as poor Black kids. There's just more poor Black kids, percentage wise, right? Percentage of the population. So you're right. It does make sense. It's actually a good idea. Here's the problem with it. It's not well thought out. So their structure doesn't make sense because it basically points back to things they already proved don't close the wealth gap. It would make more sense if you had these things structured so that when the person turned probably 25, not 18, it could then be rolled over into a long-term asset account, like an individual retirement account, where they could continue to build wealth a little bit more into maturity. Then it has the chance to be, quote unquote, generational, which is what you're talking about. That might make,
Okay.
I get that. That would make sense. But turning it over to an 18-year-old to buy a house is like silly. Or to buy the only thing harder than starting a business is buying a business. So they would be better off taking that money and putting it into a diversified portfolio of stocks than trying to buy a business with it. So it's about, the idea is okay, but the structure is super weak. And I think that, but that's what they're trying to promote. And I think that this piece is like clear the way for our idea, right? Nothing else works. Saving and investing don't work. Starting a business don't work. Getting education don't work. But a massive government redistribution of wealth, that'll work. Not to mention that's so politically off to the left. Good luck with that one anytime, until our demographics change over the next 30 years or so. But I'm all for reparations, which is what they promote. I'm all for child accounts. I don't know if the baby bond idea is kind of not sound, but child accounts. I'm for the guaranteed, the guaranteed job program idea they have. I don't think it'll close the wealth gap, but it will reduce unemployment. But closing gaps is tricky because that's going to be extremely hard to do realistically. It's going to be very slow, very incremental, and you got to put some definition around what wealth gap closing is over a given period of time to even plan for it. Otherwise, nothing that you put out there really makes sense until you even know what wealth gap closure looks like.
Well, these are a lot of really interesting points that you brought up that I'm going to ponder on, I guess, over the next few days, and that my viewers, all of you out there who like to research like I do, now you have a lot of new things that have been put in your brain to look up and think about. But I want a lot of you out there to share your thoughts via social media with Mr. Washington, because over the past few, how long have we been doing these webcasts now? A couple months, right?
Couple months.
Yeah, over the past couple of months, you've really broadened my perspective. You broadened the perspective of my little viewership. And, as I told you via text yesterday, come June 1st, I'm going to be traveling, and hopefully I end up coming back online, but I don't really know because my life is shifting majorly right now. But I just really want all of you out there who are watching to make sure that you do follow Mr. Washington on @WealthGapNet, because he's on to a lot of very interesting key points as to just how finances work, how the world works, and how, if you were not born with the complexion for the protection, how it affects you. And I think that especially our young Black youth needs to be more aware of what you know. But also to all my girls out there, all the women, we've really got to start taking a lot of things that have to do with finances and our future into our own hands now, because an increasing amount of us are opting to remain solo, whether you're a solo mom or just a solo woman like me. So sorry, I'm a little bit low energy today. I got to hurry up and get going.
I'll leave you with this because I know you're tired. I'll leave you with this tidbit. And this is why this wealth gap closing thing is so tricky. Just 2 days ago, the Congressional Budget Office came out and said, and this is on my Twitter feed, and I'll send you the link, that 92% of the benefit of the 20% pass-through, which is the small business tax break, which is huge, is going to people making $100,000 or more. Almost 60% of it is going to people making $1 million or more, meaning if you're not a small business owner and you're not set up so that you can get that pass-through income, you're missing out. And yet you're saying, well, you can't close the wealth gap by going in. Listen, the wealth gap, that's going to cause the wealth gap to explode even more. So you've got to actually more people going into business, not waiting for, a government program. I mean, that's just not going to realistically cut it, because the wealth gap is exploding right before our eyes. So happy, what's today? Wednesday. Happy Wednesday to you. I'm going to watch the clip.
Well, it's being that the wealth gap is exploding, it's a good thing that your Twitter account is Wealth Gap Net. It really is, because you're right there.
It should blow up, shouldn't it?
You're right there. You might end up becoming the Jay Leno of the wealth gap.
But
you never know.
It made me change my moniker a little bit, because I realized that wealth gap closure is sort of a silly concept because it's not well defined. Plus, it's really about wealth building. It's
like to close it. Instead of trying to close it, maybe you should exploit it, because that's what everyone else is doing. Everyone else is exploiting things. I'm a little bit disenchanted when it comes to life, just because of the level of exploitation that goes on in every single damn sect of the world, of any industry. It doesn't matter. If you want to be rich, you got to be a jerk.